Good morning, and thank you for joining us for the Osgood Symposium on Law and Revolution in the Middle East. My name is Mazen Masri, and I'm a PhD candidate here at Osgood Hall Law School, and I'm one of the organizers of this symposium. Before we start, I just want to say a few words about how this symposium came together. As all of you know, 2011 was an extraordinary year for the Middle East, with many revolutions and changes. And of course, many people followed closely what was happening in the Middle East in that year. As lawyers, we were also interested in questions such as what's going to happen after the revolutions, what kind of constitutional changes will it bring about, how will these changes take place? And the overarching theme behind these discussions was the ambivalent relationship between law and revolution. While the idea of organizing an academic event was there from the beginning, after reading an article by Professor Lama Abu Audeh, a group of us came together and started discussing options, and then we decided to organize a panel and invite her. And very quickly, this turned into a collaborative project that brings together faculty members, graduate students, and also JD students. And the initial panel turned into a symposium where we are going to discuss a range of topics related to law and revolution. The symposium brings together a mix of emerging scholars and established scholars, and will hopefully provide a very healthy mix of theoretical and practical debates. So before we start, my colleague Tala will walk you through the program for the day.
Good morning. My name is Tala Khoury, and I'm a second-year JD student here at Osgood. And I'm also one of the organizers for the symposium. First of all, I'd like to welcome you to Osgood. We are very excited about the symposium today, and we are delighted that you guys could join us. We'll kickstart the day with our keynote speaker, Professor Richard Falk, a renowned scholar in international law. The first panel is entitled Theorizing Revolution, Theorizing Law. This panel will explore various theoretical lenses and whether they are appropriate in explaining the events that culminate in a revolution. It asks whether these theories apply to the Middle East and what role law plays in revolutionary change. The second panel, entitled Revolutionary Change, the Emperor's New Clothes, questions the validity of the constitutional reforms that followed the toppling of leaders in what the media has dubbed the Arab Spring. Are these developments viable in creating the state that the protesters have imagined? The third and final panel, entitled Law, Revolution, Democracy, An Unconventional Marriage and an Unexpected Offspring, looks at the social, economic, and cultural changes on the local level as a result of these revolutions. Before concluding, we would like to thank the Critical Research Laboratory at Osgood, the Nathanson Center at Osgood, OHLS Dean's Office, Professor Sherry Aiken, Professor Bruce Ryder, and Professor Susan Drummond. Without them, the symposium would not have been possible. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Assistant Dean James Shribopoulos.
Good morning, everyone. I'm here on behalf of the Dean, Lawrence Austin, who unfortunately wanted to be here, but unfortunately is away in Thunder Bay due to a long-standing commitment. So I'm standing in his place to extend a welcome to you on his behalf and on behalf of the law school and on behalf of York University. We're extraordinarily pleased to be hosting this very timely symposium on law and revolution in the Middle East. I'm not going to say anything about the symposium itself. It's just been introduced quite splendidly. But it's the result of a considerable collaboration that is worth mentioning and paying close attention to, because it's noteworthy and commendable. It's a collaboration that's taken place here at the law school with the support of the Jack and May Nathanson Center on Transnational Human Rights, Crime and Security, the Critical Research Laboratory on Law and Society, and with the support of the Dean's Office. And it's a collaboration that's brought together the work and effort of students within our JD program, within our graduate program. A number of PhD students are involved in organizing this event, and we thank them for doing so and taking this initiative. And they've worked tirelessly toward the end of bringing the symposium into existence and executing it. And in that process, they've collaborated closely with our colleague, Professor Hengame Saberi. And it's the result of their combined efforts, of which we're very proud, that this symposium has been made possible. So I thank them for taking the initiative, for bringing this event into existence, and we're all going to enjoy the fruits of their collective effort today. The agenda is full and intriguing. The list of participants is most impressive. So on behalf of Osgoode Hall Law School and York University, welcome again. I hope you enjoy the day. Thank you.
Please join me in welcoming Professor Hengame Saberi.
Good morning, everybody. Rahel Levin, the host of some of the most prominent European salons of the late 18th and early 19th century, and whom Hannah Arendt, more than a century after her death, cherished as her closest friend, once wrote, "Our age is the age of self-consciousness, of self-reflection, pushed to imbalance and to infinity. Today, the strongest potential for heroism, the most capable and effective personality will dry up, shrivel, evaporate in smoke and flame if he should happen to be doubly gifted, if he should be truly rich in human values, that is, if his strength should be joined by a speculative, reflective spirit, by sharp intelligence and comprehension, a mobile, poetic imagination, a powerful but tender heart. In the fragmented modern world today, only one option is left to the enlightened individual, that is the heroism of scholarship." The circumstances prompting this letter of May of 1811 to Alexander von der Marwitz do not seem to be sufficiently unique to make it irrelevant to our time today. The only option left to the enlightened individual might now as then be the heroism of scholarship. And few in modern international legal scholarship have availed themselves of that opportunity as brilliantly as our keynote this morning, Professor Richard Falk. The heroism of his scholarship speaks loudly and clearly of a keen mind inspired by a compassionate heart. Okay, now facing the daunting but delightful task of introducing a scholar of Professor Falk's stature, it's customary to say that our guest today doesn't really need any introduction. But usually what happens is that, and it's ironic, that the presenter goes on, and the host goes on nevertheless, often presenting the guest amazing accomplishments one by one, as though a lengthy introduction was in fact in order. I'm going to avoid that listing Professor Falk's academic accomplishments by way of an introduction, to respect that etiquette in its true word. And also because running through the enormously long list of his accomplishments would basically be nothing short of running on a high-speed treadmill in the shortness of the breath it will cause. Instead, what I like to say more on is the heroism of his scholarship. I'll go back to that concept. It's hardly an exaggeration to say that Richard Falk has written on international law and almost any social, political, historical, institutional, environmental, and biological phenomenon that has been customarily the subject of international law in the literature. But that is expected of the scholarship of a man whom even opponents cannot help but admire for his curiosity and vastness of intellect. What makes this broad vision heroic, although, what one can describe as an exceptional talent to capture the past, salvage what's worth saving, and discard what could be done without, in the interest of a more promising and inclusive future. It's that humane optimism, together with a sharp analytical mind, translating it to legal argumentation, that distinguishes Richard Falk's scholarship. Of his Yale policy-oriented mentors, whose jurisprudence for a free society, Professor Falk, in fact, established, cultivated, and followed more true to the word than anything that the Yale masters could have ever imagined, he wrote, something that, in my view, offers the clearest glimpse into an enviable combination of humane optimism and critical thinking. Their enterprise, he said, too fully embodies the modernist legacy of the Enlightenment, with its particular turn towards universal science and reason, a meta-narrative of society and humanity that implicitly and operationally situates the West at the center. In this regard, the absence of critical perspectives reflecting the interests of the excluded constituencies, women, non-Westerns, the poor, the indigenous, is a fatal flaw. A free society is most likely to emerge from the interplay of difference and sameness, a dialectic of sorts. A jurisprudence of human dignity would have to include the training needed to reconceptualize citizenship, moving it by stages to encompass an imagined future that is a time dimension, as well as to ensure or to infuse traditional territorial affiliations of citizenship, that is a space dimension with world order values. Yet, true to character of a teacher who deserves the name truly, Professor Falk did not leave this critique without positive guidance. More than a decade before, elaborating on the possibility of the Grand Reformation, such as was known to the 16th and 17th centuries, he offered a prophecy about the potentials of the disempowered to claim a proper place in the New World Order. The shadowland, he said, through which it's possible to discern openings that contain significant potential for reform, including the possibility of exerting an impact on the character of the emergent system, is more accessible to those who are victims of the old order, apostles of the new order, but who yet see the hopes for a benign transition depend on the success of an ideological synthesis. So what happened afterwards? What happened was that, and here I'm pretending that I'm giving a history of the entire international law scholarship in 60 seconds. So what happened afterwards was that this message was ignored, unfortunately, or was not heeded sufficiently. So the scholarship divided into two different parts, one part only looking at the trees and one part only looking at the forest, but not imitating what Richard Falk had so successfully done, having one eye on the trees and one eye on the forest. So what happened was that the critique was left in the hands of those who only critiqued for the sake of critique, and the enthusiasm about the New World Order with no critique or reflection on the past left on the hands of those who enjoy using new acronyms as R2P. So when you think about R2P, a responsibility to protect for those who may not be familiar, you wonder for a second if it's really a weapon, is it a concept, or is it a mathematical equation? So R2P, in its brevity, ignores the history of people for whom we have an R to P them. So what happened was that this basically distance between the forest looking or the forest attention and the tree attention continued up until today, in the sense that international law scholarship has lost its politics or heroic, basically, nature to a great extent. Bernard Williams once said that, and this was a point about contemporary moral philosophy, that contemporary moral philosophy had found an original way of being boring, which is by not discussing moral issues at all. If you twist that a little bit, you could use that about international law as well. International law has found amazingly original ways of being non-original, meaning that either dwelling on the past without looking into the future, or only enthusiastically building doctrinal and institutional frameworks for a future that we don't even know. So in that sense, when you look at Professor Park's heroic scholarship, you see that it's written with a sense to make, in the company of great some of the great American writers, to make suffering endurable, to make evil intelligible, to make justice desirable, and to make love possible. So anyone who actually thinks or has been struggling with law review submission would retort probably with mockery, if not disdain. How could you submit anything to any legal publication thinking of making evil intelligible, et cetera, et cetera? But this is what had happened in Professor Park's scholarship, in fact. What is echoed in Professor Park's scholarship is in line with the lines from Herman Melville, who says, "There is sobbing of the strong and a pall upon the land, but the people in their weeping bear the iron hand. Beware the people weeping when they bear the iron hand." Thank you, and I'll welcome Professor Park to the stage so that we know this was the appetizer. We are waiting for the real food now.
Good morning, and thank you, Hengama Saberi, for that very moving introduction. I'm both grateful for it and somewhat intimidated by it. It sets a standard that is almost unattainable in this kind of orientation. But let me say a few things that frame the remarks that I want to make at the start of this conference. And to begin with, I want to commend the organizers of this event, because it's, as far as I know, it's the first serious effort to look at these revolutionary happenings from the perspective of law. And it's something that is in a sense, at the core of what has been happening, but those that are participating are less aware in many ways. The consciousness of the relevance of law to both the past that is being repudiated and the future that is being dreamed about and aspired to, in both contexts, there's a sense of the overwhelming relevance of politics, that it's essentially and existentially a political process. And in that sense, the idea and relevance of law tends to be marginalized or repressed in understanding, the self-understanding of what is taking place. Part of what I think makes this symposium valuable at this point is that it's sufficiently distant from the original events a little over 2 years ago to give some sense of detachment, yet it also needs to be understood as commenting upon an unfinished set of processes. That it's that what was unleashed by the events that started in December of 2010 in Tunisia definitely has unfolded in a series of stages, but is continuing to unfold. And it's not clear what the outcomes will be. So one's assessing, one's talking from and assessing a moving train. It's not an event. There were events, of course, but that's not the key dimension. And I think also it's important to reflect upon at the outset what we mean in this context by revolution. It's not, so far at any rate, it's very difficult to connect the developments in the region with the kind of template of revolutions that we have from the French, American, and Russian revolutions, all of which were concerned with the radical reestablishment of a different kind of state. And we're very focused on the transformation of the state. And we're preoccupied with that change of the governmental relationship to the people of the society. And in that sense, except in the Libyan case, where there was foreign intervention, the old regimes have not been, in a sense, frontally challenged. In fact, there is a persistence of the old regimes that, including the military dimension of governmentality, that is really at odds with the revolutionary tradition. So in that sense, we have to struggle to understand in what respects is this, are these developments to be properly called revolutionary. And I think that it therefore, one of the things that this symposium is directly and indirectly addressing is the changing nature of revolution, and what is it that we are attaching that kind of language to, which implies at the very least a radical rupture between past, present, and future. There is also, it seems to me, at the outset, what was initially described as the Arab Spring reflected a sense that spring is a good time. You know, the famous opening of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, that April is the sweetest month, which T.S. Eliot repudiated by talking in The Wasteland about April being the cruelest month. And one can feel 2 years later, people are much more nervous about calling these developments in the region the Arab Spring. People, including myself, tend to talk about Arab upheavals or the Arab awakening. In other words, a feeling that this optimism that was embedded in the terminology of the Arab Spring has not been vindicated by the subsequent developments of the last 2 years. And of course, the darkness of this process is epitomized by what's happened in Syria and the sense that this kind of revolutionary challenge to the status quo has produced one of the ugliest and unoptimistic developments since the end of the Cold War. And neither the international community, the regional community, or the various contending factions in Syria there's no good end game for the conflict. And that coming after Libya, which was also whatever else it was not something that one would have associated with the terminology of the Arab Spring, because it involving the balance in Libya was tipped by a European intervention that had all the earmarks of a post-colonial reassertion of primacy in the Arab world. And of course, why Libya generated the intervention, and Syria, which is a much worse violent encounter, has been largely subject to interventions below the radar level, below the supplying arms and doing things to bolster one or the other side in the struggle. But one can't overlook the fact that where Western interventions have taken place in the region, there's always been a lot of oil. And where they haven't taken place, there is no oil, or there is no substantial oil. And now the whole diplomacy of threat directed at Iran is, again, another country that is an important oil producer. But if you think about Iran, Iraq, and Libya, those are the three countries in the region that have been targeted for significant intervention. And the oil producers that have positive relations with the West, no matter how autocratic they are, their abuse of their own societies is forgiven and overlooked. Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, because, again, oil diplomacy, which is not, or maybe a better terminology is oil geopolitics, that is not respectable to discuss in the mainstream discourse, seems to me to be an important element that needs to be at least acknowledged. It can be interpreted in different ways, and each of these situations has enough distinctiveness to make it important to be a little bit more subtle and sophisticated about how one understands the pattern of, I think one needs to understand both the pattern of intervention and the pattern of non-intervention. They both flow from an important set of factors that operate in different directions, and they're all, but in both directions, are overdetermined. For instance, the non-intervention in Syria, as opposed to the intervention in Libya, can be partly understood as recognizing that Syria is a much more difficult undertaking, because the Assad regime, despite all of its criminality, has and continues to have significant popular support from minorities and from those that fear the opposition as much as they fear the existing order. So it would be a much more uncertain undertaking to try to achieve regime change by an interventionary undertaking. And of course, the diplomacy of Syria is conducted under the shadow of the diplomacy of Libya. The fact that Russia and China were misled in the UN Security Council about the nature of the Libyan intervention, which was supposed to be a no-fly zone for limited humanitarian purposes in relation to protecting the population of Benghazi, turned from the outset into a regime-changing intervention where the Gaddafi government was targeted. And that was a significant betrayal of trust in the Security Council process that hasn't been sufficiently recognized and appreciated. And the United States, that has been very hypocritical, in my view, in attacking China and especially Russia for its failure to support a more robust response to Syria. How can Washington expect trust when it was so abused in the context of Libya? And it reflects also, it seems to me, a very questionable attitude toward the UN as a rule-governed international organization of states. It was clearly being used there to validate a geopolitical operation that had no real foundation in international law. The humanitarian, narrowly conceived humanitarian undertaking might have had a strong justification in international law. But the idea of a non-defensive use of force in order to achieve regime change without a specific mandate from the Security Council And even that seemed to contradict the UN Charter itself, which precludes, or has been thought to preclude, intervention in internal civil strife. So there is in the background, in other words, a set of issues that are wider than what has occurred in the region itself, but impinge upon our understanding of the regional developments. And coming to the Arab awakening, I think that part of what made it made such an extraordinary impact was how unexpected it was. That it had a kind of shock effect in which it arose and was seen at the time as a purely spontaneous set of events occurring first in Tunisia and then in Egypt and then spreading beyond. But the explanations came afterwards. At the time, it was really a surprise that was one of the biggest surprises in the period since, certainly maybe the biggest surprise since the end of the Cold War, as far as a major development in international society. And it illustrates what I like to call the politics of impossibility. In other words, if you had been interpreting the political future of Egypt or Tunisia or Libya, they all were viewed as ultra-stable societies, where the relationship between the state and society seemed in many ways oppressive, but at the same time, there was no real perception of a politically meaningful resistance. That is, our understanding of political potentialities is so deficient that we can only interpret such developments in retrospect. And lots of knowledgeable people come and say why it had to happen after it happened, but they never tell us it would happen before it occurs. You know, many people in think tanks in powerful countries earn their living by retrospectively interpreting these kinds of developments. So what I think was so exhilarating about these initial events is that it re-established hope in relation to the power of people to affect history. People became, again, agents, recovered as a sense of historical agency, and especially in the Arab world. That was something that had the general conventional wisdom was that these societies were passive and could only react by violence to violence, that they were conditioned by a logic of violence. And so that these populist eruptions in Tunisia and Egypt seemed so extraordinary because they not only were unexpected to occur at all, but they took this form of nonviolent opposition to to brutal and ruthless regimes that exhibited extraordinary courage that was also creatively deployed as a way of challenging hard power. That was very inspiring to many of us as this and after a period where there was this sense that it was very difficult to envision an emancipatory politics taking place in the era of globalization. See, the globalization with its dominant ethos of there is no alternative, created, that was essentially a economic slogan rationalizing the commitment to neoliberalism. When Fernando Henrique Cardoso, a left socialist, became president of Brazil, he said, he justified his unexpectedly supportive relationship toward the IMF and World Bank by saying neoliberalism is the only game in town. That was, that in other words, there was no alternative. And this was also felt politically, that there was a disillusionment that accompanied the failure of Soviet socialism and the triumph of Western capitalism. There was a disillusionment with political projects that were not shaped by what I would call the horizons of feasibility. In other words, incremental changes, the opposite of something that was transformative in intention and effect. And I think one of the reasons that the terminology of revolution was so quickly applied to these developments was precisely because it was not, it was beyond this horizon of feasibility. That it was, again, in my own terminology, it was, these were events that took place on the horizon of desire, that they reflected a normative refusal to be conditioned by by the constraints of feasibility. That is, the politics defined as the art of the possible, which is the general understanding of politics. What I'm trying to suggest in this way, and it bears on the relevance of law as well, is that we have to understand these kind of developments under a different sort of template, which I'm underscoring perhaps not very convincingly as the politics of impossibility. And if we think about it from different perspectives, just as a introductory matter, it was historically the most abrupt set of changes that occurred since the end of the Cold War. And as far as the non-Western world was concerned, it was the most important series of developments since the colonial wars after World War II. And if one thinks of it geographically, it was clearly something that had never previously been as prominent. The prominence of the Arab world was on a global scale, had never previously occurred. And civilizationally, and I think this is of central importance to the looking at these events through the lens of law, there had not been an appreciation of the degree to which a genuine politics that reflected indigenous sentiments would bring to the surface the strength of Islam. See, the strength of the Islamic dimension of these societies was marginalized in their perception because of this perception of modernity as a secularizing phenomenon that overcame these deeper religious, cultural sources of identity. And so what was dramatically appreciated, including by the participants, was this potency of Islam if the society was allowed to genuinely participate democratically. Let me put it in a very provocative way. The more democratic the societies in the Arab world are allowed to be, the more Islamic will be their form of preferred governance. See, and I was very struck by this in my experiences in Egypt over the last 2 years, because Egypt is the country that I probably know best in this region, having visited it 3 times in the last 2 years, the first shortly after the Tahrir Square events, and most recently just a couple of months ago. And what was striking, 2 things were striking in this regard in relation to Islam. The first was that after Tahrir Square, the overwhelming sentiment in Cairo was, we want to build an inclusive democracy. And an inclusive democracy means that the Muslim Brotherhood must participate, must be allowed to participate in ways that it had never been allowed to do during the Mubarak era. And that was coupled with the sense, expressed in different ways, that this participation would result in a likely political strength of something like 30% of the society. That informed Egyptians who were not part of the Brotherhood consistently thought 30%, maybe 35%. And some who were particularly secular in their own orientation said, if it should happen to be 40% or more, that will mean trouble. And what, of course, occurred was parliamentary elections that showed two things that hadn't been anticipated at all. A support for the Muslim Brotherhood position that was at about 50%, and a support for the Salafi, more radical modes of Islam at another 20 to 25%, giving over 70% to these Islamic orientations. And this, it's a very complicated part of the Egyptian story in particular, but it's true all over the region. It's true in Tunisia in a more subtle way. It's also been true in even in the Iraqi elections. This posed and continues to pose a deep dilemma for the non-Islamic, both the non-observing, the secular Muslims and the minorities, a huge problem. Because on the one hand, they espouse democracy, but at the same time, they don't want to live with the results of democracy. And there's what I would call a vicious circle of distrust that emerges out of this pattern, because those that are fearful of what it means to have this Islamic orientation in government act in radical opposition and increasingly feel they can't hope to attain control again of the society by democratic means. So the opposition in Egypt, for instance, is calling for the resignation of Morsi, Mohamed Morsi, and treating Morsi more or less as Mubarak was treated. In effect, saying he's an illegitimate leader, and his illegitimacy is validated by his alleged refusal to abide by judicial outcomes, judicial constraints on the way in which a new constitution is drafted, or the way in which the electoral process is shaped. In other words, law is used as a way of repudiating democratic preferences in the society. Just as law was used in the Mubarak period to validate oppression. So you have the two, and the Islamic leadership, the Muslim Brotherhood leadership, is faced with its own dilemma, because it doesn't control the bureaucracy, including the judiciary, which is more, continues to be more oriented toward the secular Muslims and the Mubarak period, and therefore wants to put as many roadblocks in the path of Morsi as possible. At the same time, the economy is declining in a free fall sort of way. I don't know if any of you saw the World Economic Forum puts out an annual report on tourism, and they rated Egypt in this report that just came a couple of days ago 140th in the world as far as safety and reliability of places where tourists should go. Lower than Pakistan, Yemen, Chad, and other countries. In other words, it is the interaction between the newly radicalized opposition to the Morsi government is producing an economic crisis that puts pressure on the government to behave in a Schmittian sort of way, in the mode of Carl Schmitt of claiming a right of exception and, in actuality, restoring the kind of emergency powers and circumvention of legal procedures in order to create some kind of stability that would allow the society to reach the kind of normalcy that will enable some kind of economic development. And then there's a second set of dilemmas that are posed, which is how can a leader that emerged out of this revolutionary process deliver on the expectations of social justice without making a compromising bargain with the neoliberal world economy. Morsi needs the $4.8 billion that the IMF is dangling before Egyptian eyes, but they'll only give it if he makes the sort of adjustments in fiscal discipline and reductions of fuel subsidies that will impose hardship on the very people that staged the revolution to ease the pain of their economic life. So that in my view, you have these two sets of terrible challenges that I'm not sure any leader could surmount in the larger political context. I have a friend, Nabil El-Arabi, who's the current Secretary General of the Arab League and was foreign minister immediately after the Mubarak overthrow. And he was offered the opportunity to be president by both the armed forces and the Muslim Brotherhood were prepared to, but he had the insight, maybe he was underestimating possibilities of solving these problems, but he had the insight that Egypt was ungovernable given these sets of conditions that I'm describing. And that whoever took on the job of running the country was destined for a humiliating failure. See, and that's the tragedy of this aftermath of Tahrir Square and looking at the situation 2 years later. there was a second aspect of this failure by informed Egyptians to predict their own future. And that was when I was there in 2011, there was an overwhelming consensus that the next president of Egypt would be Amr Moussa, who had been a foreign minister in Mubarak period, but had been also supportive of the revolutionary developments. And people said, well, he has the best name recognition, and he's not perfect, he's somewhat opportunistic, but he's the best that we can hope for, and this is what is certain to happen. It ends up he gets less than 10% of the vote. See, and so that people inside the society itself didn't understand the forces that were unleashed by this revolutionary process. And they didn't understand it because of essentially two things. The first, Cairo is not Egypt. And what people think would be most likely to occur in Cairo was not reflective of the wider society. And secondly, there was a sense on the part of secular intellectuals and people that were really shaping public opinion at the time in Egypt, that they were the dominant strain in the revolutionary process. And one of the aspects of this, the originality of this process, was that it was to such a great degree shaped by apolitical young people who prided themselves on not having a program and not having distinct leaders. In that sense, it's against the revolutionary tradition associated sometimes with the terminology of vanguardism, or that very much in the Leninist thinking that you need that revolutions can't succeed without leadership and without a very clear program that includes the destruction of the pre-revolutionary state. This, the animating forces in both Tunisia, but especially in Egypt, were self-consciously repudiating this kind of revolutionary tradition. The Google executive, Wael Ghonim, in his book Revolution 2.0, was self-consciously saying Revolution 1.0 was based on dogma, ideology, and vanguardism. In Revolution 2.0, it is the people that create the revolution and make it up as they go along. It's an improvisation. It's the politics of improvisation that was its originality, had a lot to do with its originality. But once Mubarak fell, the organized political forces are what dominated the scene. And you had a presidential election in its second phase after the other candidates were eliminated, that an Egyptian friend of mine said, offered us the worst possible choice. A choice between the Muslim Brotherhood on the one side and Ahmed Shafiq, a general in the Air Force general, who was an unrepentant Mubarak loyalist. So, see, and that's the other kind of failure of this period, where you have an apolitical orientation toward revolutionary change. Now, what's exciting about that apolitical orientation is that it doesn't view revolution as only about the control of the state and the transformation of the state. And in my last visit to Egypt, the only hopeful people were people who didn't talk about what was going on at the level of government, but who said all over the country there's labor organizing, local empowerment. We are rebuilding democracy from the bottom up. Now, you don't hear about that. Is that even in this book about that Ghonim wrote? Is never mentioned, although his point is this is a revolution without heroes, or put differently, everybody in the society is a hero. See, and that's quite a radical statement. In the background of these developments are two closely connected sets of developments that have a pedagogic relationship to what's going on in the Arab countries, and particularly, I think, in Egypt and Tunisia. One is the experience of Iran as a negative model of what happens to a revolutionary process, the Iranian Revolution being the most important precursor to these developments, if it moves in an explicitly theocratic direction. And the other is Turkey, that has both non-Arab neighbors of the Arab world. Turkey that has had a leadership consisting of devout Muslims who have managed to create a situation in which they've neutralized the military, stimulated economic growth, became a force in regional and even global foreign policy, and greatly raised the stature and visibility of Turkey as a state in the world. A kind of positive, see, if Iran is negative, Turkey is positive as accommodating an Islamically oriented political leadership, although it has, as in Egypt, deeply polarized Turkish society, where the opposition in Turkey, as in Egypt, sees no way of recovering power democratically. And it had hoped originally to recover power by a military coup, and when that hasn't happened, it's been in a state of collective depression because it doesn't see any path that can challenge this leadership. In Egypt, the situation is similar and different. The army was from the outside, the armed forces in Egypt from the outset were an unknown factor. Initially, many people thought, including those that the activists, the young activists, thought we need the armed forces to preside over a transition to an orderly future. And we can trust them to step away from power as soon as the new constitutional process is established. Other people said at that time, initially, we're very uncomfortable with this role of the armed forces because they have a big stake in the private sector, and they'll never allow a progressive democratic leadership to assume control. And there now is the rumors on the part of the opposition that the Muslim Brotherhood and the armed forces have struck a kind of Faustian bargain, and that's embedded in the new constitution, where the armed forces retain most of their authority that they had in the Mubarak period. Muslim Brotherhood is given support, and in exchange there is a kind of assurance that the approach taken will be one that is compatible with neoliberal economic policy. Let me bring these comments to a close by pointing to what I think are the two elements that most stress the legal system and that are worthy of very careful reflection that I think is underpins the symposium. The first is this dilemma about democracy. How can a new social contract be constructed in these societies that respects the will of the people and at the same time does not gives security to those that feel themselves threatened by majoritarian democracy? Are there ways of modifying majoritarian democracy that are better able to bring the goals of the revolution to fruition? And what was revolutionary was this idea that people can shape their own future. That was what was revolutionary. It wasn't the transformation of the state. It wasn't the seizure of state power. It was the style of doing politics to generate change. But the change rested on this proposition that the unity that was fashioned to overthrow the autocratic leaders, and this is the common element throughout the region, a repudiation of authoritarian autocratic leadership, and to a lesser extent, a rejection of this subjugation of the country to external forces, particularly the US. Those two things. But how do you create a post-autocratic democracy under these cultural conditions? And what role can law play in constructing such a post-autocratic democracy? And the second related issue is, can we learn from the Turkish experience, particularly, how to exhibit a fidelity to Islamic values of natural justice without alienating the rest of society. See how Turkey has not been overly, I mean, it's been able, because it's an evolutionary process in Turkey, not a revolutionary process, it has been able to so far manage this relationship, but it's not a comfortable one. Egypt, and to a lesser extent Tunisia, and maybe Libya and Syria, show the fact that this is unresolved, this whole connection. And it raises the broader question of how to mediate between religion and politics in the context of these Arab societies. One of the people that's most insightful about this relationship in the Islamic countries, and particularly in the Arab world, is Khaled Abu el-Fadl, who draws a crucial distinction between Sharia, which he identifies with natural justice, and Sharia law, which is the interpretation that varies from place to place and sect to sect, and should not be part of any governing process. But what he tries to argue is that Sharia draws on universal considerations, whereas Sharia law is much more particularistic and therefore not an acceptable foundation for a legal order. Let me end with a quote from Gandhi, giving Gandhi the last word on the Arab world, because I think it's important in this second phase of reflection not to lose sight of the broad historical optimism that was generated by these events 2 years ago. And Gandhi's words were, "I remember that all through history, the way of truth and love has always won. There have been tyrants and murderers, and for a time they seem invincible. But in the end, they always fall. Think of it, always." Thank you very much. I probably talked too long.
Do you want to take questions?
Yeah, sure. If we have, I'm sorry. Did I talk too long?
No, we can. Organizers, can we take 10 minutes or 15 for questions? 10? Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so 10 minutes for questions. Conventionally, comma, the English grammar says a question sentence ends with a question mark. We are enthusiastic about question marks. We are slightly less enthusiastic because the time is short for about sentences that end with a full stop, unless they are very short, 60 seconds or shorter as in a way of comments. We are not enthusiastic about sentences that end with exclamation marks because time is short.
You can go to the microphones that are on both sides of the room. So just help yourself to the microphones on the side there. Yes.
And if you could please say your name and affiliation quickly, that would be great too, if you may choose so.
Lama Abu Audi, Georgetown Law School. I think that you're right on the Islamists, but that's the news of yesterday. I think we're now phase 3. the decline in their popularity has been astounding. They started with 75% votes for the parliament, 50% for the president, which puts the Islamists and the leftists together. Now, by all accounts, their popularity is dipped even further. So I think we need a new theory about, we've figured out revolution, Islamist. I think we're in the post-Islamist phase now, don't you?
I didn't get to the last part.
I wish you were right about that. My sense is that this more recent vote was very misleading because the choice was so confined, for one thing, and secondly, because the Salafis have now more or less gone into the opposition. And so it's a kind of misleading situation because there's a tension within the Islamic ranks themselves that is significant. And furthermore, a lot of the people I spoke to in Cairo during my recent visit, who had originally been supporting the revolution, now are feeling that it hasn't, as they put it, nothing has changed and our life is worse. So that, and that includes people that identify in an Islamic way. See, the decline of the economy has led people to opportunistically feel, understandably in a way, that Mubarakism without Mubarak is better than what the revolution has so far delivered. So it's a little bit of yesterday's news in the sense that I think the Islamic dimension was more prominent in the immediate aftermath, and various developments, including some mishandling of the situation by the Morsi government, has led to considerable discontent, including among earlier adherents. But I still think that the fundamental problem of polarization exists throughout the region, and I think the Turkish experience is suggestive of the best you can hope for in trying to reconcile these two sides that are threatening to one another. The sort of secularized, non-devout Muslims and the religiously oriented Muslims. Turkey is 95% Muslim society, at least 95%. Yet it has this sharp polarization. And the same phenomenon is, I think, very much at issue in Egypt, Tunisia, in a different way in Iraq, and in a different way in Syria.
Speaking of Iraq and speaking of Islam in the Middle East, first of all, my name is Ruba Al-Hassani. I'm here from Osgood, SJD.
Can you talk a little louder?
Louder?
I don't know whether
Sure.
the microphone is.
The microphone's taller than I am, but my name is Ruba. I'm an SJD candidate at Osgood Hall Law School, and thank you for such a great, fantastic keynote speech to open up today's symposium. I had a couple of questions in regards to the role of Islam in the Middle East and the ongoing revolutions and sectarianism or sect, and what kind of role it plays in the Bahraini revolution, which receives little to no media attention, especially in the academic environment. And another question with regards to how the political climate in Syria could affect the Iraqi political climate, which is stuck between a sanction-imposed Iran and a Syria that's going through revolution and civil war, and a Turkey that's meddling in Syrian affairs. So Iraq is surrounded by all that, and I wanted to know your thoughts on these two issues. Thank you.
Those are two very big questions. If I understood correctly, the first is really the relevance of sectarianism to these struggles, and of course it is a very important element, and is one that has generated interventions from within the region and beyond the region. I mean, one of the factors I didn't have a chance to talk about was the opposition of the conservative Gulf states to this revolutionary process. The degree to which, for instance, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates regarded Mubarak as a positive political force and were deeply opposed to any assumption of political influence and power by the Muslim Brotherhood. So you have a lot of complexities aside from the Shia Sunni complexity that is most evident in Iraq, but is also present in several of the other countries. It's in Egypt, of course, it's a different kind of sectarianism. It's the Salafi Wahhabi versus the Brotherhood, and the Salafis are themselves divided. It's a very complex part of this reality, but I think it is one that makes the legal challenge of establishing authentic democracy something that calls for what I would put maybe too strongly, the reinvention of democracy for these cultural, civilizational conditions. As far as the bearing of the Syrian events on the region and on Turkey, of course, it's the Turkish-Syrian relationship is itself a big story, where it was the centerpiece of Turkey's diplomacy based on zero problems with neighbors. And then the disenchantment with the Assad regime led Turkey to be prematurely interventionist in a way that has precluded, I think, an internal accommodation. So Turkey, and of course the West, Israel, US, have played a role. One thing, again, I would have liked to have mentioned more, well, I've mentioned it all, was the bearing of all these developments on the Israel-Palestine conflict and the degree to which the failure of the Palestinians to achieve self-determination represents the major lingering item on the agenda of decolonization. And so you have that strange irritant in the middle of the Arab world, which is a settler colonialist regime that is supported by the geopolitical muscle of the United States, creating a anti-historical presence that seems unchallengeable. See, that can't be neglected in the overall assessment of what can happen and has happened in the region.
Okay, so we have 3 or 4
I'll be
questions.
brief, I promise.
If you could pack your questions in 30 to 40 seconds. And let's take all of the questions, and then Professor Falk will have a choice to take any or as many as them as he wishes.
I'll avoid all the hard ones.
I hate to be asking a question again about Islam, particularly because of discussions in the West and orientalizing aspects of like the crazy Islamists in the Middle East, but kind of again echoing Professor Lama Abouda's question. And
a little louder, I'm having a little trouble.
Particularly your statement about the more democratic the Middle East becomes, the more Islamic it becomes. And I'd just like to make 2 points on that and maybe ask a question afterwards.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but only questions. Time is short.
Okay.
But I didn't get the question was you're questioning my assertion. Is that right?
I can leave it for later.
Okay, we can talk.
When I was a very long time ago a political science student, and we were dealing with revolution, and I found this definition to be useful. Revolution is the overthrow or the repudiation and the thorough replacement of an established political system. That being the case, I have no idea why you call what occurred in Egypt as a revolution, or indeed what occurred anywhere else. It is simply an adjustment of a maladjusted area, and I'd like your comment.
Let's take one more question and then.
Okay, so my question was also, Nimr Sultani, Buffalo Law School. My question was also about your statement that the more democratic, the more Islamic the mode of government. Now, I agree with you with the polarization of identities, which reifies the religious and the secular, but I think things are in flux and these identities are contested. So I disagree with you on this statement on 2 grounds. First, I don't think there's a correlation, a necessary correlation between a mode of government and the Islamization of society. Remember that Islamization of Egypt started with the Sadat, not with Morsi or the Muslim Brotherhood. Secondly, I don't know in what sense do you use the word Islamic. Is it synonymous with conservative, traditionalist, organized religion, or a political Islam? If it's organized religion, that's true also of the West, specifically the US. If it's the rise of conservatism, that's also true of the US. So I don't think that you need to see the sociological fact that most of the citizens in Egypt and Tunisia belong to the Islam in terms of civilization and religion as and the example of Tunisia, who excluded Sharia from the constitution despite the fact that they are the ruling party, Nahda being the ruling party, is an example of the fact that you need to distinguish between the two. Thank you.
Okay. Would you like to take any of these questions? I think we should start with questions. We should be one last. Okay, so, one last question and 30 seconds. One last question. Okay.
Thank you. Faisal Baba, I'm a faculty member here at Osgoode Hall Law School. My question is regarding, you described, Professor Falk, disorganization created by the continuation of the secular opposition to the Islamists who have risen to the top or who have seized the reins of power due to their better organization. And you've described their vulnerability in the face of this continuing force of revolutionary change, delegitimizing them. At a time when it seems what was needed was for people to be working together. And the result is that we had a really terrible constitutional drafting process that led to a document that nobody can be really proud of. And it's my sense that a lot of it is due to lack of expertise, lack of good process. I'm wondering if you have any comment in relation to the importance of the process of constitutional redrafting through this sort of transformation.
Good. Thank you. I'm sorry not to be able to. These were all very important and good, relevant questions. I knew when I said the more democratic, the more Islamic, that I was inviting trouble. But I think it is something in different guises, different forms. And I think it's important what you say, that there are different ways of understanding and characterizing what one means by Islamic. And we must try to do that. I can't do it in my 30 seconds that I have, but I recognize the issue. As far as the very important conceptualization of revolution and why this isn't, why the implication of the question is, why do people call this a revolution? There's no doubt that the participants thought they were staging a revolution, or many of them did. They thought that, and but from the perspective of that kind of definition, you're absolutely right that it was at most an upheaval or an uprising, not a revolution. But what I think the more thoughtful participants would respond is that they were recreating the understanding of revolution as something that had its own unique manner of challenging the old order, that the process of creating a politics without a dogma to guide it and without leaders that would shape it is something not exactly new, but it's a radical break with the dominant understandings of revolution. Now, whether one goes with that claim that these were revolutions because of their style and their method, or one rejects that claim because there wasn't a transformative effect on the earlier institutions, is something that, as long as one's intellectually clear about, there's no way of saying one definition is correct and the other is wrong. But it's, again, it's very important, I think, to be aware of this contestation about the meaning of revolution, which is, I think, part of what is at issue.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this, and thank you all for your attention. We'll have a short break and we'll come back to our first panel. Please join me in thanking Professor Faulk and welcoming him one more time.